I never should have gone to Montsepo Cemetery at night. The locals in the small South Carolina town warned me about it. "That place isn't right," an elderly woman said when I asked for directions, "especially after dark." Her words had a weight to them, like she wasn't just being superstitious. But I'm stubborn and curious. As a history buff, I couldn't resist the stories tied to Montsepo, a cemetery where generations of enslaved people were buried. Some said the cemetery was cursed, the spirits of the dead angered by the injustices they endured in life. Others told tales of strange lights and whispers in the night. It was supposed to be just a quick visit. I wanted to document the old headstones for a blog I was writing. I told myself I didn't believe in ghost stories. The cemetery was even more haunting than I'd imagined. The wrought iron gate groaned as I pushed it open. The hinges rusted with age. The air inside felt heavy, like it carried the weight of the past. The headstones were old and weathered, their inscriptions barely legible. Many were unmarked, save for simple wooden crosses, long since rotted and collapsed. The trees loomed overhead, their mossy tendrils swaying in the humid breeze. I walked carefully, snapping photos with my phone. The moonlight cast eerie shadows, and the chirping of crickets seemed muted, almost distant. Then I heard it, a low hum, faint but distinct, like a chorus of voices blending into the wind. I stopped, holding my breath. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast stillness. No answer, but the hum grew louder, and it seemed to be coming from deeper in the cemetery. Against my better judgment, I followed it. The sound led me to a cluster of graves beneath a massive oak tree. Its branches stretched out like skeletal arms, and the moss hanging from it looked almost like shrouds. I crouched down to examine one of the headstones, its surface cracked and worn smooth by time. That's when I saw them. Faint, flickering lights danced among the graves. They were pale blue, almost like fireflies, but larger and more erratic. They swirled and weaved between the headstones, and as I watched, a chill ran down my spine. I had heard stories of ghost lights, omens of death, some said, or spirits trying to lead the living astray. The humming grew louder, almost deafening now, and I swear I could make out words, though they were garbled and incomprehensible. My phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me. When I pulled it out, the screen was glitching, flickering with static and strange, shadowy shapes. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, the crunch of dried leaves and twigs underfoot. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was no one there. The footsteps continued, circling me. My pulse pounded in my ears as I called out again. "Who's there?" No answer, just the footsteps getting closer. I started backing away, my flashlight shaking in my hand. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of something, or someone, standing between two headstones. It was a tall figure, draped in what looked like tattered clothing. Their face was obscured, but I could see the glint of eyes watching me. I froze, my breath hitching. "I'm sorry," I stammered, unsure why I was apologizing. I didn't mean to disturb anything. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring. Then it raised an arm and pointed toward the oak tree. I didn't wait to see what it wanted. I bolted, running as fast as I could toward the gate. The humming followed me, growing louder and angrier, and the lights swirled around me like angry wasps. I didn't stop until I was out of the cemetery, the gate slamming shut behind me. When I got back to my car, my hands were trembling so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. My phone buzzed again, and this time the screen showed a photo I didn't remember taking. An image of the oak tree with the tall figure standing beneath it, staring directly at the camera. I left town the next morning, my blog post unfinished. I still can't explain what happened that night, but one thing is certain. Montsepo Cemetery isn't just haunted by history. It's alive with something far older and far more terrifying. And it doesn't like visitors. It was supposed to be a normal practice. Just drills, scrimmages, and maybe some trash talk between teammates. But Coach had us running suicides way later than usual, saying something about building character or whatever. By the time we wrapped up, it was pitch black outside. I wasn't worried at first. I've biked home 1,000,000 times. The route's familiar. Cut through downtown, follow the winding road past the woods, and glide down the long stretch by Montsepo Cemetery. That last part, though, That's where the dread always sets in. Everyone in town knows about Monsepo Cemetery. They say it's haunted. The older kids whisper about shadowy figures, cold spots, and voices calling your name. I never really believed in that stuff, but tonight, alone, with only the weak beam of my bike's light cutting through the dark, I wasn't feeling so confident. The night was unnaturally quiet as I pedaled down the deserted road, the tires crunching against the gravel. The warm, sticky South Carolina air clung to my skin. When the cemetery's wrought iron gates came into view, my stomach dropped. I slowed down, considering taking the longer route home, but that'd add another 20 minutes. The thought of being out here any longer than necessary made my skin crawl. I gripped the handlebars tighter and took a deep breath. "Just speed through," I muttered to myself. "You'll be fine." As I reached the gates, I did something stupid. I closed my eyes. I figured if I couldn't see the cemetery, I could pretend it wasn't there. My legs pumped furiously, the bike rattling beneath me as I tore through the humid night. Suddenly, the air turned cold. Not a refreshing breeze, but an icy chill that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I opened my eyes and looked around. The world was bathed in moonlight, but everything seemed off. The headstones looked sharper, their shadows deeper. The usual hum of crickets was gone. All I could hear was the rhythmic clinking of my bike chain. Then it snapped. The chain gave out with a metallic clatter, and the bike lurched forward. My heart leapt into my throat as I jumped off, stumbling to keep my balance. The bike crashed to the ground behind me, the sound echoing in the unnatural silence. I didn't even think, I just ran. The road ahead stretched endlessly, flanked by headstones and gnarled trees. Every step felt like it took an eternity, my sneakers pounding against the cracked pavement. I glanced over my shoulder, and my breath caught in my chest. There was someone standing in the middle of the road, back where my bike had fallen. A tall figure cloaked in shadow, their face covered by the darkness. They didn't move, but I could feel their gaze, heavy and cold, pressing against me like a weight. I ran faster, my lungs burning, my legs screaming for relief. The cemetery's edge felt miles away, but I didn't dare slow down. Behind me, I thought I heard the faint crunch of footsteps, matching my pace. But when I looked back again, there was no one there. Finally, the wrought iron gates were behind me, and the chill lifted like a curtain being pulled away. The warm, sticky air returned, and the crickets resumed their song. I collapsed onto the grass by the side of the road, gasping for air. When I looked back at the cemetery, it was empty. My bike was still lying in the road, its twisted chain glinting in the moonlight. I thought about going back for it, but my gut screamed no. I walked the rest of the way home, flinching at every rustle in the trees, every snap of a twig. When I finally made it to my house, I locked the door behind me and collapsed into bed, trembling. The next morning, I went back for the bike with my dad. It was still there untouched. But when I picked it up, I noticed something that made my stomach churn. Scratched into the frame in jagged letters was one word: run. It was supposed to be a peaceful afternoon, something different to break up the monotony of our weekend. My cousin Marie and I had been talking about visiting Monsepo Cemetery for months. It's one of the oldest burial grounds in South Carolina, known for its historic headstones marking the graves of former slaves. We thought it would be a good chance to teach the kids a little history while spending time outdoors. So there we were, two moms, her teenage son Cody, and my 6-year-old daughter Ellie, bouncing down a gravel road in Marie's old SUV. The cemetery sat at the end of a dirt path flanked by sprawling oaks draped in Spanish moss. It was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the crunch of tires on gravel and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. "I don't like this place," Ellie said softly from her booster seat in the back. "It's just old, sweetie," I reassured her. "There's nothing to be scared of." Cody rolled his eyes but didn't say anything. I could tell he wasn't thrilled about spending his Saturday wandering a graveyard with us. The cemetery was smaller than I expected, surrounded by a rusted wrought iron fence. We parked just inside the gate, and Marie and I got out, armed with a couple of brushes and spray bottles of water to clean off the moss-covered headstones. Cody and Ellie stayed by the car at first, but Ellie soon started wandering closer to the graves. The headstones were fascinating, many dating back to the early 1800s. Some were simple markers, barely legible, while others had intricate carvings. Marie and I lost ourselves in the history, brushing dirt away from the inscriptions and murmuring about the lives these people must have lived. Ellie, meanwhile, was unusually quiet. She stood near the car, staring into the distance. "What are you looking at, Ellie?" Cody finally asked, his voice tinged with boredom. Ellie pointed toward the back of the car. "That man." Cody frowned and looked where she was pointing. "What man?" "The one standing there," Ellie said matter-of-factly. "He's wearing overalls like a farmer. He's just watching us." Marie and I both stopped what we were doing and turned to look. There was nothing there. "Ellie," I said gently, "there's no one there, honey." She just shrugged, unconcerned, and turned her attention back to whatever she thought she'd seen. Cody muttered something under his breath and went back to scrolling on his phone. As the afternoon wore on, the air grew heavier. The sunlight seemed dimmer, filtering weakly through the clouds. Marie and I both noticed it and decided it was time to leave. "Come on, kids, let's go," I called, wiping my hands on my jeans. Ellie was already back in the car, but Cody was lagging behind, dragging his feet. "What's the rush?" he asked, half joking. Marie and I exchanged a glance. We didn't want to admit it, but something about the atmosphere had shifted, like we were being watched. As we pulled out of the cemetery, Ellie's voice piped up from the back seat. "Mommy," she said in that eerie sing-song way only small children can manage. "Yes, sweetheart," I replied, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "Who was the man watching us?" she asked. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. "There was no man, Ellie," Marie said firmly, her voice a little too loud. Ellie shook her head, her curls bouncing. "Yes, there was. He was by the car the whole time. He waved at me when we left." Cody turned around in his seat, his expression serious for the first time all day. "What did he look like?" he asked. Ellie beamed, happy to be taken seriously. "He was really tall and he had a hat. His overalls were dirty. He didn't smile, though. He just stared at me." The car fell silent. Marie and I didn't say much on the way home. Cody stayed quiet too, which was unusual for him. Only Ellie seemed unaffected, humming softly to herself. Later that night, as I was tucking Ellie into bed, I couldn't shake the image her words had conjured, a tall man in overalls, standing silently by the car, watching us. "Ellie," I asked hesitantly, "are you sure you saw someone?" She nodded, her eyes wide and innocent. "He was there, Mommy. He followed us all the way to the gate." I kissed her forehead and turned off the light, but sleep didn't come easily that night. Sometimes I think about that afternoon at the cemetery, and sometimes I wonder if we really left that place alone.